Welcome to Connections, a podcast from the Graymere Church of Christ in Columbia, Tennessee. Our goal is to have discussions and messages that encourage us and strengthen our faith. We appreciate you joining us. Let's keep learning and growing together. We're glad that you joined us for Connections, and I'm excited that we have Ben Diles with us. We've been thinking through in these conversations for really the last couple of months about how we can build our faith. And so Ben is going to share with us in a discussion about how we specifically can find ways to build faith in the lives of teenagers and our young people. That's obviously something, whether you're a parent, whether you're a church member, that we're thinking about. So I really appreciate Ben making the time to be with us during the end of the school year, which I know is also very busy. But I thought I would begin just letting you kind of introduce yourself. There'll be a lot of folks that you already know in the community, but tell us a little bit about your story and what you do.
Okay. I am the director of spiritual development at Columbia Academy, and I've been there for a long time. This is my 27th school year there. Heather and I met at Harding, and Dr. Bill Thrasher came to Harding looking for football coaches, and he was looking for a head coach, but I was trying to get into teaching and coaching at the time, and he wasn't that interested in me until he found out that I was married to a math teacher, and then suddenly I was a lot more attractive as a candidate. And so we came as a package deal, always thinking we would leave and go back to either Arkansas or even maybe move to Pennsylvania, where her parents were from at the time. And instead we just fell in love with Columbia and been here ever since. And I have a long family history in Christian education, back in Arkansas, and have been in Christian education as a student or a teacher since I was in the third grade. And CA has just become kind of, I guess, our family away from family. And so I started teaching history and coaching football, but I was willing to teach Bible. So they gave me a Bible class, which is kind of crazy to entrust a bunch of ninth graders and their Bible knowledge to a 23-year-old right out of college. But, and I kind of slowly over time realized that instead of going back and being a head football coach or trying to become a school administrator, or teach history at the college level, those are all things I'd considered as what I wanted to do long term. I found that I enjoyed teaching Bible more and found more meaning and purpose in it. And so now I preach at Cathey's Creek, and I've been preaching for nearly 10 years and teach Bible at CA kind of exclusively and oversee all of our Bible things, chapel and service projects and things. And I love it. It's easy to tell a kid why this matters when they ask in this class. And so that's where I don't envy my wife when she's asked, like, why does the Pythagorean theorem matter? I'm like, it doesn't matter. And so, but for Bible, it's, I think it's life changing, and it changed my life for sure.
Well, and that's probably for math teachers is probably not a popular response to say it doesn't matter.
No, but I usually rolls her eyes.
I could relate to that though. Definitely. And I think it's good to mention too, that in your role, you obviously are teaching Bible, but you also have a role that really encompasses kind of the whole campus almost. What are some of the things that involve, like, even the younger ones? You do like chapel, you mentioned.
So, well, I kind of have some degree of oversight and involvement with teaching Bible at every level. So I kind of am aware of, like, the Bible curriculum in our lower school, and we tried to redirect how we were teaching. We used a pre-purchased curriculum for years and years and years. And now some of our lower school teachers have kind of written their own curriculum, but it's more text heavy as opposed to, and I don't necessarily mean the way they teach it in the classroom, but if you're a student at CA, from at least on our Columbia campus, from kindergarten through your senior year, the way we have set up Bible to be taught to you, you'll essentially go through the entire Bible 3 times from kindergarten through your senior year. And so your wife is involved in that, the fourth grade Bible teacher, and she does a great job, and I'm glad that she's excited about it. And so my connection to the lower school is more tenuous. It's more kind of like almost like, I don't know, an advising kind of role, and kind of checking in to see where we're at, kind of directing, and then involved in some chapel down there. I speak several times, help Coach DeJarnett get song leaders periodically it becomes a lot more involved from 7th grade on.
Yeah.
And so I plan our daily chapels, which we have chapel every day, but in a different format almost every day. And so I kind of set up, we have a choice chapel where they can pick a lot of different options, kind of almost like a little lectureship on campus. And so our teachers and some students sometimes will even lead those, but our kids can go to those about every other week. We'll have singing chapels and traditional speakers in small groups that meet once a week. And so those small groups will go out and do service projects at the Well in Mount Pleasant or the People's Table downtown, or and then we have service days too. We just had a walk for water where we raise money for Healing Hands, and so the canned food drive, all of those, everything that has to do with service or kind of mission trips or our Bible teachers. Then I kind of at least have some hand in all of that. I don't oversee or direct all of it, and then I teach our seniors too. Jonathan Jones Jr. and I, between the two of us, teach all of the seniors in senior Bible, and so that's still the most fun part of the job. It's the most trying and rewarding part of the job, but I like what I do. So those are all the things that I've end up doing kind of at CA.
Well, and that's helpful to think about just in light of what we're going to talk about, because when we think about spiritual growth, I just thought it was worth pointing out, you have kind of that holistic view of you're in touch with what's happening in elementary and advising on that, and then seeing them all the way until they have you as a senior in Bible. And so not only have you seen the stages of development just in teaching in general, but especially thinking about spiritual things and what can they at different ages understand, comprehend, accept. And so I thought it might be good to start off by just saying, what have you found? This could be for teens, this could be for any age, but what have you found that that stands out to you in the spiritual growth process of teens when you watch them grow? What do they need? What kind of questions are they asking? What are some of those things that come up?
That's a good question, and there's kind of like, I hear in that question 3 kind of questions, and so
I'm bad about that. So you can do it one at a time.
That's okay. And so one is kind of just in like, so obviously to me, I also have three kids. They're all in either college now, or one is actually working at Harding, and so having raised those 3 kids, there's a line, it's in 3 John where he says that he has no greater joy than to watch his children grow in the faith. And that's not an exact quote, but kind of along the lines of it. And so I sympathize with that. I identify with that sentiment. And I feel that way about my own 3 children, but I also feel that way about, kids within the church at Cathey's Creek or Columbia Academy. And so I want to answer that the first part of the question with like, what do they need more than anything? And and this is hard, especially when because in a context like at Graymere or Cathey's Creek, it's pretty easy to say, and it's important to be stressed, that the thing that our kids need most in their walk with God is to see it modeled in their parents. And it's kind of strange because it's not, I read a lot of research findings. I don't remember any of them. So, I can remember I can remember the summations of them better than I can like exact studies or quotes. But the idea that, what we do impacts kids. So if kids see their parents studying, they see their kids valuing gathering together with other Christians, they see their parents praying for them, their parents are kind of open when they make mistakes and, put kind of asking for forgiveness when that's needed and giving forgiveness freely, then what I see that our students at CA are missing is that we've got a good number of students who don't have that modeling. And frankly, within the church, we've got a good number of families that if you ask the kids what their parents value, they can tell you, but it may be like football or travel sports. It may be family vacations. It may be work. And so the number one thing they need is for their family to model faith and to model essentially prioritizing faith. And so, I don't think it's as much like setting up like a set routine for a devotional period with your kids every night necessarily, as much as like they can tell by how we act, what we value. And if we value faith, they're much more likely to value faith. And so, and from the educational process, like what they can like learn and where they're at in their different stages of development, the younger they are, man, they're just like, they're excited, like just sponges, and will soak up everything. We have a good number of students at school that that come from a wide variety of backgrounds, as far as like both from their Christian families. They come from a wide variety of denominational backgrounds, but also just interest in faith. Some with none at all. They all, when they have energetic and enthusiastic teachers who are excited to share with them the basic stories of the Bible that when you get old, you kind of get jaded to. You know, I remember teaching, like, when we first moved to Columbia, we taught in West Seventh, like some of the kids' classes, and it seemed like every week we were talking about Moses or Noah. You know, it seemed like every lesson was about the same 4 or 5 lessons. Yeah. Well, these kids, in kindergarten, first and second, and third grade, they're excited to hear that stuff for the first time, especially if they've never heard it before. And so that enthusiasm is, and so it's easy to get kids excited about what you're excited about when they're young. Yeah. And then when they're in middle school and older, they start, asking kind of real questions, and they start kind of getting tempted more by their own desires and drawn into things that so they want to know. They're interested then about kind of like questions about what's right and what's wrong. How far can I go in this particular path and it be okay? And so you have an opportunity to discuss, like, when you're in kindergarten through 4th grade, it's kind of like you discuss the what happened, and then like 5th grade through like all the way through their senior year, it's kind of like, and this is why that happened. Yeah. You can kind of get the behind the scenes of, like, say, Abraham offering Isaac up as a sacrifice. That would have to be terrifying if you're hearing that as a 5 or 6-year-old for the first time. You know, you're told to take your son and go sacrifice him, and God commended him because he did. Right. But then you see that he spared. And so when you're a senior, you can use that same story and say, what God didn't ask Abraham what he asked Abraham to do to see if he was willing to do it, but didn't make him do, he was willing to do for us. Yeah. And so you can kind of make connections to everything. Just yesterday, I had the opportunity to kind of substitute for the 7th grade Bible teacher, Jonathan Jones, who I co-teach senior Bible with too. And so I was in 4 of his 7th grade classes, and I just asked him what was the one thing that they learned. And every one of those classes, or all 4 periods, and he'd be proud to know this because he's actually they at least remember one thing. The thing that they remembered, though, was that the Bible, they kept saying the Bible is a circle. And what they were saying was that it all pointed to or looked back on Christ, and that it all interrelated. And so I guess ultimately, the older they are, the more mature they are, the more they can grasp and understand and ultimately appreciate and hopefully put it into practice. And so that was a long answer, and I don't remember if I know I said there was a third part.
Good. Well, I did.
But I got 2.
I combined a few questions in there. But there are a couple of things just in that stand out to me just in thinking through that. First of all, as a parent, what you mentioned, which I think is so true and is challenging, is just the idea that our children know what matters to us. And that, as a parent, if you think about asking your child the question, what matters to your mom and dad? Like, that makes you stop and think, okay, what have I displayed? What am I showing? And so that's a big part of it. But then also, I do think that transition from here's what happened to here's why this happened, kind of the abstract thinking behind it. I think too, that resonates with something that we talked about a few weeks ago. Some of the research that Kyle Butt has done when he was doing his dissertation was on people who were no longer in the church. And one of the things that stood out that I've really been thinking about is the people he interviewed kept pointing back to some experience at church, either in a Bible class or with someone, where they asked a question and it was either like not taken seriously or like, you should already know this, but kind of dismissed.
Yeah.
And so as you talk about that movement from what to why, it's possible that some people could be, I don't know, intimidated or maybe kind of a little bit scared when they're in a middle school class
Yeah.
and someone starts to question, why do we do this? And I can imagine for some Bible class teachers, they might be thinking, oh, number one, I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I don't,
Right.
kind of thinking through that. But what is actually happening there is a really, really good thing.
Yeah.
Because that's part of that process, that what to why. And I don't know, maybe for some of us who are older, it's a reminder that we need to be asking those why questions too. And we should understand that instead of just kind of going through it. And I just think there's something that's just an important reminder for that questioning period. It's possible, especially for kids who have grown up, maybe attending worship and grown up with families that were faithful. I think it's possible for some kids to even feel a little guilty about asking questions, or maybe I shouldn't ask these questions. But in reality, that's exactly what should be happening, because they're growing their own faith that way.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure you've probably had a lot of experiences with, kids in class asking questions, and probably, maybe I can't speak, maybe some things where you thought, well, it's been a while since I've thought about that, and kind of have to think through it.
Yeah.
And so what advice would you give to teachers, especially of that age, to kind of fielding questions, not necessarily specifics like what to say, but like how to handle those situations?
That's a good path to go down as well. And I was thinking about that before. You sent me a few ideas on the kind of questions that you'd ask, and one kind of was similar to this, and it made me think through it. I'll start with a story that happened when I started teaching at CA years ago. I mean, it was really early, like the second or third year I was teaching. But I was teaching 9th grade Bible, and we're talking about, in that class, we studied the Synoptic Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And as we got to the end of the semester, and we're talking about the crucifixion of Jesus and then the resurrection. And I had a student in 9th grade Bible, and this is at Columbia Academy, and he was new that year, but he raised his hand, and I called on him, and he said, I've heard about Jesus my whole life, and I knew about the crucifixion. What are you talking about when you talk about the resurrection? And I remember for the first time kind of realizing, so even when you're teaching kids, I think you need to start from a position of kind of assume that they don't know anything. And I don't necessarily mean, obviously most of those kids knew about the resurrection and the crucifixion, but it just reminded me that it's easy to take for granted that kids do know things that they don't know. And when I was in high school, at some point, I remember going to a youth rally at whatever, and I remember where it was at. It was Russellville, Arkansas, and I think they called it Christ Teens, but I can't remember for sure. But and at that youth rally, the teacher had us all go out and read from the book of Ephesians, and he kind of talked about Ephesians with a lot of passion and how it was unique and distinct from the other gospels, and he talked from kind of a position, and I remember thinking, I would like to know the Bible well enough to know the difference between 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Ephesians and Galatians and Paul's letters, and just how young and immature and immature is not the right way, but like kind of, it's all new, even to kids who've grown up going to church. And so when you're teaching them, to give them the benefit of the doubt that it's a legitimate question, and to know that you might have to kind of very patiently teach even really basic principles because they're just growing in their faith. And then secondly, it's okay to say, I don't know, because you're going to get kids that it's much better to say, I don't know, let's look that up and let's study about it and pray about it, than to say, to shut a question down because the question is kind of either scary or controversial. The students that I get, I do give an opportunity for them to ask. I give them a form at the beginning of the year, and it's a Google form, so they can type in a question. sort of anonymously. I mean, I could find out who asked the question if I wanted to, but I don't. And I tell them that, and they believe me apparently, because they ask lots of questions. And then we'll take through the year opportunities to look at those questions and try to answer them. And they'll ask about, things that are sort of taboo. Whether it's right or wrong to do, and you can just about list any behavior, right? And they'll ask about, is it a sin to commit suicide? And and by the time they're in high school, there's at least a few kids who have friends who either attempted it, or they've attempted it themselves, or they've had a friend who's been successful at that. And so it's a legitimate question. And so I guess what I'm saying is, and I think I say that a lot, but that any question that's asked in genuine interest is a good question, even if you think the answer is like painfully obvious, or they should already know that, or it's an area that. And so I think Kyle's research that he came across is probably accurate, that if you shut down some line of inquiry because it's too close to something that makes you uncomfortable, or something that's obviously wrong. So today, like gender identity and LGBTQ, again, just about every type of sexual practice, they kind of want to know where the boundaries are, and they want somebody to model it, and they want somebody to kind of patiently guide them to truth. And if your answers are based in the Bible, which they should be, then they generally respect them, even if they didn't have that perspective on the front end. So assume they know nothing, be patient, and try to answer their question with, sincerely, without assuming motives. And I think that all helps.
And that can be hard, especially not assuming motives, because sometimes when we're teaching it, our own insecurities come to the forefront to think, okay, why are they asking this? But it does seem 9 times out of 10, probably 9.5 times, that they're really, especially if it's anonymous, as you mentioned, and so they're not asking it to get a reaction. There's really something they're thinking about. And if they're not talking about that with Bible class teachers or with Christian adults, they'll be talking about it somewhere, and so having that environment is so helpful. But I think we all know the principle of like assuming that we've taught our kids something, or assuming, and then just realizing, I guess we never talked about that, and that can happen in the church too, that you can get to a point where you think, well, when I was growing up, I knew that by that. Everything is different. One area I see that, especially with our children, and it's just an example. It's not equal in importance, but even different songs that you sing in worship, when one song will come up, and it'll be familiar to me because I heard it all the time growing up, sang it all the time growing up, but it just isn't sung as much now. And so, I could talk to Luke or Micah, and I hadn't sung that song before. Oh man, but it's just the experiences are so different. And I think that can be true in some cases in Bible class as well. So just having that reminder of stopping and saying, there was a time I didn't know that someone had to explain this to me. So let's walk through that. When we think about, I guess it would be, are we at Gen Alpha? Is that the age?
No, that sounds right.
Gen Z. I feel like there's no 2 books I read that have the same years to delineate who's what. So I technically, in some books I'm a millennial, but some books I'm a Generation X, and so I kind of feel more like the Gen X side. But so I understand the limitations of that, but it is very real to think about the differences in just the way kids learn today. Just recently, we were explaining to our kids about the process of research for a research paper when we were, where you had like a card catalog and you
Yes.
flipped through and you had index cards.
Note cards.
That's just so different for them. But also, each generation has a set of, I think, strengths and like inclinations toward things that are really positive.
Right.
And sometimes that gets lost when people like me are saying, well, back in our day, we used to do this.
Yeah.
So what do you see with young people today that is positive, just gives you hope and enthusiasm for just the future and the future of the church and those kinds of things?
That's a good question too. And it's kind of funny how that's changed even over the course of my teaching career. Like, it's strange. I'm now teaching students that I had, and I guess that makes sense. Right. When you teach for 27 years, I'd already be a graduate student if I was just the age of my career. Yeah. But over time, I think there was a spirit a few years ago where there was kind of a rebelliousness towards authority, kind of in general. Like, those argument fallacies that people have. I don't know the right word for it, but kind of the appeal to authority. And like, you're going to do this because I told you to. Well, that would produce an automatic pushback. And now, which meant that you couldn't appeal hardly to the authority of Scripture, because when you did, that automatically, there were some people who are like, well, it's going to take more than that. Just because the Bible says so was not enough.
Right.
Now, I think today there is almost like, I don't know, it's like, I guess the best way, there's an openness to faith-based discussion now that wasn't there even 10 years ago, I would say, or 12 years ago. And so there are people that come from and I think you can see it reflected in pop culture too, when you talk about, like, a lot of these kids are influenced by, not as much maybe as a slightly older group, but Joe Rogan's podcast or Elon Musk's post or Jordan Peterson, and there's some others that are very not spiritually minded at all out there too. And I mentioned those three because I would say all three of those were very, very secular in the way they presented information even 5 or 6 years ago, and all seem to have moved kind of more in a direction of at least openness to faith. And I think that that's reflected in the teen mind of today, that they're open and enthusiastic about efforts to serve, and that's been there for a while, kind of a desire to put your faith into action. They're interested in kind of knowing God and want to know God. Now, if there's a downside, it's that there's kind of an aversion to, doing the legwork of kind of faith building. So reading anything really, not just the Bible, is kind of a generational struggle that I think it's easy when you're my age to be like, well, back in my day, we read books, for fun. And now, and I do believe the Bible teaches pretty consistently that faith is developed through hearing God's word. And so most people, and at least in recent times, have heard God's word by their own study as opposed to being taught necessarily what to. I don't mean that negatively. I just mean that, like, if you expect your kids to grow in their love and knowledge of God simply by bringing them to church and don't encourage personal study, both by modeling it and teaching it, then it's not likely to happen, even if the kid wants it to happen. Like, even kids who are spiritually hungry, it's like they don't know where the food's at. And so to teach them to kind of like, this desire you've got, it's worth putting in time and effort and energy into reading regularly, praying regularly, meeting with other Christians regularly. And so I guess that's the one that excites me is kind of the openness. And there's not much, I mean, when Jesus calls Nathaniel, he says you're truly a man without guile, kind of like open to, not not cynical. They don't have the cynicism, the cynical edge towards faith is gone. And I think that it was there 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And so that openness we can exploit it. But again, I don't know, mass media, particularly through the phone, is when all content comes in 30-second increments.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I sound like an old guy when I'm talking about that.
That's right.
But
no, I can relate. I'm with you.
Yeah, but that seems to people will put in the time into the things that they believe are worth it. And I see that in my kids too. So like our baseball team and softball team are both playing right now and deep into the state tournament stuff. Well, if a kid believes it's worth it, and Coach Estep, he makes those guys, they basically practice baseball almost year round. They'll come to school at 6:00 in the morning. They'll put in hours and hours and hours pitching or throwing or hitting because they believe it's worth it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the flip we have to switch, or the switch we have to flip. Got that backwards. But if we can convince them it's worth it to put the phone aside and to study, that we take the spark of their interest and then add fuel to it. And then I think that they'll grow. But
yeah,
I don't know.
But that's the challenge. And not just because that's a generational challenge. I'm sure that's part of that, but that's also kind of a human challenge of how many times do we not do things we know that are good for us,
right,
simply because of distraction or whatever else. And so trying to do that with this next generation or current generation, I guess, whichever ones you could see. And you've mentioned just some of the changes in your own teaching experience. And it would be I'd be interested in just knowing, I mean, that's one of the shifts that you've seen. Are there any others that stand out? And I don't mean, I know sometimes we see the lists of like, well, in the 1950s, kids couldn't chew gum and now they can, I'm not, I mean, those are interesting, but I'm thinking more just in terms of like attitude, discussion, how they relate. I'm really interested in the way you mentioned the phone, the way that changes the way we relate to each other too. I mean, so, while you're thinking that, I'll just share one thing that a friend of mine told me who was teaching a college course. He'd gone to school and then spent a lot of time in the mission field, and then came back and was teaching at a Christian school, teaching college, and at the school where he graduated. And he walked in and he said, I was amazed. I can remember sitting waiting for class to get started, and everybody was talking to each other.
Yes.
And he said, now I came in after all that time mission field and it's silent because they're all on their phones before class. And it took me a while to figure out what was even strange about, I was kind of looking around, this doesn't feel the same.
Yeah.
And he said, that's when I realized. And so I know there's some of those changes, but what are some things you've seen just
that's a good question too. So one is definitely a negative change, I think. And it's kind of while there's an openness to spiritual kind of discussion and interest in people who I think would have been closed off to God, at least in their own mind, or open to God now, I also think that there is kind of an openness about, like, we have taken live and let live mentality to like the extreme edge where there is no inherent sense of almost anything being right or wrong, and no sense. And I do think that part of that is the culture that's, it's not solely the byproduct of the phone. It's more kind of just our society kind of continuing to go down a path that we started down a long time ago, that, if it feels okay, it must be okay. And that's definitely still pretty prevalent. So like, not to judge, it's not even that. It's like, why would I judge that?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why would I even think that that's wrong? That's just them. That's just who they are.
It's like it's become common sense to have that. I can't judge. Like, that's wrong. It's morally wrong for me to judge. Like, that's almost become ingrained.
Yeah. And it applies to almost everything. I mean, there's very few, there's not many like lines a kid could cross and another kid would be like, well, they shouldn't have done that. You know, that was clearly wrong. Yeah. And there are a few, but there's not many. There's a lot that they would, so they're very kind of open and accepting of behaviors that certainly 2 generations back would have been, you know, totally frowned upon by society in general. Yeah. The other change, I think that you're right about the conversation aspect, but I also think that, and this is kind of, I think, indicative of kind of like the flexibility of the human mind or personality or whatever. If it doesn't take much, like it's not a fixed state. So next year as a school, we're going to these, and I'm sure your sons are really excited about it. And so, but we're going to the Yonder pouches where they have to put their phones in pouches and things like that. And I'm really curious to see how that'll impact not so much class, but the times in between class and at chapel and at lunch and things like that. Because I do think that, because you see it at church camp. They go to church camp, they turn their phones in at the beginning of church camp, and suddenly they're talking to each other again. Right. It's not like their interest in all other humans have stopped.
Exactly.
It's more just that it's competition. And so and so when you take away that competition, then the conversations come back. So I don't know. I do think that probably maintaining some kind of balance between our technology and other students is the challenge of their age. And if they end up learning to do that, I think it'll be good for them. But I don't know. The biggest changes are probably the behavior patterns of self-isolating, even when you're in a room full of people, and probably just being open to, you know, almost any behavior. And so I don't know.
And it's almost like you mentioned the self-isolating temptation. I think about how we're asking kids to have a degree of discipline or self-control that, if I look back in, you know, our generation at that age, would I've had the self-control to be able to put that down and do something else, you know, especially if that's something that I had not adopted later in life, but had always been part of life, you know? And so those, again, I think we do see from the perspective, I kind of feel like, you know, the back in my day guy, but I also realize that they're dealing with things that just didn't exist. You know, there are temptations that didn't exist in the same way that they do today. And so I do think that's important, especially when we read about this different generations, and sometimes we can isolate them kind of like we're studying in a lab, but just thinking these are real people. They're really struggling, and they're facing things we haven't had to face, you know, and so I think that's helpful. And I just think about people who will listen to this podcast too, especially if they don't have teens in their life, or like if they're not around teenagers a lot. I think in my conversations, like with people at church, I think they can see more clearly sometimes even than like the parents. They can see the different set of challenges. You know what I mean? I've really been encouraged by that. I feel like most of the adults I talk to, they're pretty aware of, hey, they're dealing with a different set of circumstances. And so that's always good to be reminded of. But I like the positive part of that, the part that there's so much potential in just encouraging us in spiritual development. I guess we could close by just, I could ask you a question that within like 2 minutes, you know, distill all the wisdom of teaching spiritual maturity. No, but is there anything else that you thought of that we didn't get to that has kind of been in your mind, or have we solved all the problems?
Well, I don't know about that.
Settled.
Yeah, I would say that, like, I'll start with kind of the generational divides that we sometimes see. I think it's really common I've come to start to think that a lot of the generational talk is just like you mentioned, like it's kind of arbitrary where they draw the line between one generation and the next. And it kind of makes you start to think that a lot of that's just kind of made up. And so I don't mean that it doesn't happen. I think it's kind of more like stages of life where you're at. And when I interview all of our seniors as part of my Bible class, so I interview them one-on-one. It takes a long time. I just finished yesterday was the last one for this semester. And I talked to them for 30 or 40 minutes. And usually one of the questions I ask is, what advice would you give yourself if you go back to 7th grade? And a lot of times the advice is very similar. It'll be something like, take advantage of more opportunities, put yourself out there more. Don't care what other people think. Kind of don't procrastinate, do your work. And all of that's great advice. And 7th graders are absolutely incapable of following it.
Right.
Like they're just not, it is beyond the ability of a 7th grader to think like that. But when you're a senior, you can think like that.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of truth to that for this generation too, that as they mature, they will eventually look back on the generation that's younger than and be like, well, in my day, we didn't, they'll do the same thing. And it is true that they've got some unique challenges that were not there before, but people are still people. And so I'm going to end with just this kind of idea, like, how do we bridge that generational divide? Well, even the most modern studies still show the single most influential people in a kid's life are their parents.
Yeah.
The single most influential people, and the single most influential person in the spiritual development. And there's a lot of evidence that's kind of reflecting this lately. It's pretty clearly the father. And I don't mean that to discount the mother's work at all. I can't imagine living my life without my mom or my kids being raised without my wife. It's impossible for me to think about that. But so if you're a father, you have a special charge given by God to see to the spiritual development of your children, and they will follow your example much more than they will your words or the words of any other person. And the way to bridge that is, so at school, we've got a teacher that no matter how, and seniors are funny because they're adults, but they're still kids. They're like in adult bodies with adult freedoms in many ways, but they still kind of think like kids. And if you talk about the teachers that they have, if I mention it in any way whatsoever, and I can say this here, Graymere, because Sally is a member here, but if any even hint at anybody mistreating Sally Craig, and those kids will, are furious about it. I mean, because they love Miss Craig. And why do they love Miss Craig? Because they know Sally Craig loves them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the single biggest bridge from one person to another person, and particularly from one generation to another generation, if they know you care about them and they believe you care about them, they will listen to every word you say. They may not do it, but they're going to give you an audience. They're going to pay attention to what you do. And if you show them in any way that you're like, you don't have the time of day for them, or that you try their patience, or if they don't think you mean it, then they'll turn off to you in a heartbeat. And that has not changed. In 27 years of teaching, the best way to get to a kid is for that kid to know you care for them. And so whether they're your own child, your own grandchild, just somebody at church, and there's kind of some of that other generational like faithfulness studies, like at the top of the list is the example of parents, particularly the dad. But like next on the list for like best predictor of whether kids will remain faithful, do they have like 3 connections with somebody at worship outside of their generation? So if you're here at Graymere and you see a kid walk in the hall, if you develop connections to kids, you are making a generational impact on their faith.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if the Lord knows what he's talking about.
Right, yeah.
A new command I give you, to that you love one another as I've loved you.
Yeah.
I mean, that is still the way that by this they will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. And that's true across the ages and is still true today. And so that's be like Sally Craig. That's right. If you're gonna put it in 3 words, those are the 3 words, or 4.
Well, you're not a math teacher.
No, that's correct. So obviously.
No,
obviously
but that's so good, true, because we do all this research and we come to all these conclusions, and then we flip through scripture and like, oh, okay, so this is already there. We're not the first ones to figure this out. But yeah, I appreciate you making the time to be with us, and appreciate everyone for watching and or listening. If you're listening and you'd like to watch, that's on our YouTube channel. And if you're watching and you're thinking about where can I listen to this, pretty much everywhere you can do podcasts, Spotify, Apple, iTunes, all that stuff. So is iTunes still a thing anymore? Does that exist? Okay. I never voted. So yeah, iTunes, whatever. And I guess we should get to a point where we have the little subscribe thing or something on there. I probably need to do a better job of subscribing to that. But thank you for listening. And then also, if you are in the Murray County area and you don't have a place to worship, you're always welcome to worship with us at Graymere. We're thankful for the opportunity to serve God in this community, and we hope you continue joining us for some conversations that will help us grow in our faith. Thanks for being part of Connections.
Thank you for being part of Connections. We hope it was an encouragement to you. If you live in the Columbia area and don't have a church home, we would love for you to worship with us. You can find out information about meeting times, classes, and what to expect at graymere.com. You will always receive a warm welcome from the Graymere Church of Christ.